There's one part that Paul talks about reincarnation in his letter to the Romans, which I think is so important. I'm going to first tell you in my words what Paul was saying, then I'll read to you what's written in the actual letter, as they translated it in the 4th century. Paul was saying that he lived a life before the 10 Commandments. And at that time he coveted, because the 10 Commandments said you cannot covet. It's a sin if you covet in the 10 Commandments. But if you lived your life before the 10 Commandments, Paul coveted, which means he had a life that was a sexual life, promiscuous perhaps, and he said there wasn't a sin then because the 10 Commandments hadn't come about. But then he died, and he was born again later on in a period of history after the 10 Commandments. So now when he coveted, it was a sin. And he realized he had a problem now because he was born again after the 10 Commandments. And now that his practice of his sexuality was different and the value different because of the 10 Commandments. And this is, and he's talking about reincarnation, but this is actually how it's written in the New Testament. I did not know sin except through the law, talking about the 10 Commandments. And I did not know what it is to covet, except what the law said, you shall not covet. But sin, finding an opportunity in the commandment, meaning that it ended up showing up in the 10 Commandments, then produced in me every kind of covetousness. Apart from the law, sin is dead, which means if there was no 10 Commandments, there wouldn't be this sin. I once lived outside of the law, meaning before the 10 Commandments. But when the commandments came, sin became alive. And then when I died, and the commandment that was for life, it turned out to be a death for me. So it's tricky. You've got to understand what Paul was saying because of the way they worded it. They didn't want you to try to relate it to reincarnation. That Paul had actually said that he was talking about that he lived before the 10 Commandments and it wasn't a sin then. But that's what Paul was saying. And it was a direct remarks regarding reincarnation. In fact, he lived prior to the 10 Commandments. Now, Paul continued to say the following. What I do, I don't understand. I do not understand. For I not do what I want to do, but I do what I hate. Again, you might not have used the word hate, but this is what they're saying. For I know that good does not dwell in me, that is in my flesh, meaning in his ego. For I do not do the good that I want to, but I do the evil that I do not want to do. Now, what Paul is saying there is that he realizes that when he's coveting at this time in his life, after when he's been born as Paul and living his life as Paul, that he's been telling his disciples and his teachers in administration, I don't want you to get involved sexually with the women you come in contact with if you're an administrator at my church. And Paul himself was having relationships with different women and as he traveled around the entire Roman Empire. He was an unmarried man, he was single, and he felt guilty about it. He felt, I have a double standard, one for those who are my teachers, those who are my apostles, and teaching in the administrators of my church, and one for myself. So let me repeat again. What I do, I don't understand. For I do not do what I want, but I do what I hate. For I know that good does not dwell in me, that is in my flesh. For I do not do the good, but I want to. But I do the evil I don't want to do. I see in my members another principle at war. Now he's talking about his members, his sexual parts, his sexuality. He says, I see in my members another principle at war with my mind, taking me captive to the law of sin, to dwell as my sexuality wants me to, as my members want me to. Miserable one that I am, who would deliver me from this mortal body? He was pretty hard on himself, wasn't he? My soul and spirit 2,000 years ago. I was having this problem. I was having this difficulty, saying, how do I deal with this now? That was my thorn in that was Paul's thorn in the side. He wasn't a gnome. He wasn't a dwarf. He wasn't a person who had a club foot. He wasn't a person with this incredible speech impediment. He wasn't a person who was stuttered. His thorn in his flesh was his sexuality. He went on to say in chapter 8, for those who live according to the flesh and are concerned with the things of the flesh, And then there are those who live according to the Spirit, with the things of the Spirit. And later on, and again, he's speaking of flesh, he's talking about his desires. Because later on he says, but you who are not in the flesh, meaning you who don't live that way, on the contrary, you're living according to the Spirit of God inside of you. If only the Spirit of God dwells in you. So even back 2,000 years ago, Paul was saying the same thing that I've shared with you today, that the Spirit of God dwells inside every one of us. For he continued to say that if the Spirit of the one who raised Joshua from the dead dwells within you, the one who raised Joshua from the dead will give life to your mortal bodies also, through that Spirit of God that dwells within you. You heard me say this just 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago when Sarah and I were together, that the Spirit of God dwells within every one of us, and that's why we have life. And this is the same thing Paul was saying 2,000 years ago in his letters to the Romans. The same message, that the reason your mortal life has life in it is through God's Spirit that dwells within you. He went on to say, the Spirit itself is witness to our spirit that we are the children of God. Isn't it amazing if you think about it, that the same words and thoughts that Paul was saying 2,000 years ago, the same words and thoughts that we're talking about on our website and I've talked about in my books. It hasn't changed any. In this letter to the Romans, Paul makes another interesting comment, in that I believe deals with reincarnation. He says that, quote, again, these are the translations that were done in the 4th century, which is not the way I would word it, but he says, we know that all creation is grown in labor pains, talking about the labor pains that a woman has when she's giving birth. Even until now, he's saying even until now. And not only that, but we ourselves, we have the first fruits of the Spirit, meaning we have God's Spirit, and we're also grown within ourselves, and we wait for adoption, the redemption of our bodies. So what was Paul saying to the Romans? He was saying that even today, when a woman gives birth to a child, that fruit within her is our Spirit of God. Our spirits, our souls are going to be born again as we redeem another new body. I like the first sentence that he says in chapter 9. Paul says, I speak the truth in Joshua. I do not lie. My conscience joins with that Holy Spirit in bearing me witness, and I have great sorrow and constant anguish in my heart. And that's what I felt when I was writing Time for Truth. I was speaking the truth in Time for Truth. And I spoke with a lot of great sorrow and great anguish in my heart, because I was speaking through the soul mind of Paul. Here's another place in this letter to the Romans where Paul is speaking. I think he's referring to reincarnation. I know he is. He's talking about a passage in the Old Testament where they say, where he's saying that when the two twins, Jacob and Esau, was born, these were twins of, I believe, Abraham. They went on to form the Jacob became the leader of Judaic religion, and Esau became the leader of what became the Arab religion. But anyway, he says, when they had been born, they had done anything good or bad, in order that God's plan will continue. And as it's written in the Old Testament, he says, I love Jacob, meaning God loved Jacob, but he hated Esau. God wouldn't have hated Esau, but let's say that he had concerns about Esau, and he was talking about their past lives. How could God love a child that was before he was born and not love the other one the same way, or had different feelings about the other one, and they hadn't been born yet? It would have been based on their soul and their past lives experiences. And this is what Paul's referring to, and that's what it says in the Old Testament.